Please subscribe the channel, like and share the video for more video. When people imagine feudal Japan, they usually picture a very specific aesthetic: cherry blossoms falling in slow motion. Try not to stay awake. Stereotype 1. Everyone was a samurai according to popular imagination. Feudal Japan was populated almost entirely by samurai. Just wall-to-wall samurai. Every man, woman, and child apparently owned at least 2 swords and a strong opinion about honor. In reality, samurai made up maybe 5 to 10% of the population on a good day. The rest were farmers, artisans, merchants, monks, fishermen, laborers, and people who were just trying to get through the week without being taxed into oblivion. Samurai were an elite warrior class. They were expensive. They were trained. According to legends, samurai woke up honorable, brushed their teeth honorably, and went to bed after an honorable day of extremely honorable violence. The truth is complicated and slightly embarrassing. Samurai absolutely valued honor, but what that meant changed constantly. Honor could mean loyalty until it didn't. It could mean bravery until retreating was more practical. It could mean moral virtue until your lord told you to burn a village. Bushido, the famous way of the warrior, was not a fixed code during most of the feudal period. It was written down much later, when samurai were already becoming obsolete and deeply nostalgic about themselves, which is always when people decide to formalize values. In practice, samurai were human. They lied, they cheated, they switched sides, they held grudges for decades, and they absolutely killed people over insults that would now be settled with a passive-aggressive email. Honor was real, but it was flexible, and often very convenient. Stereotype 3. Samurai were master swordsmen. Now this one is partially true, but also heavily edited. Yes, samurai trained ostensibly with weapons. Yes, swordsmanship was important, but the sword was not the primary battlefield weapon for most of Japanese history. That honor goes to the bow, and later, the spear. Swords were sidearms, symbols of status, personal weapons for close combat and duels. On actual battlefields, samurai were more likely to be mounted archers or spear fighters. They fought in formations, they followed orders. They did not engage in dramatic one-on-one duels, while everyone else politely waited. That idea came later, and mostly from stories written by people who were not there. Also, many samurai were mediocre fighters, because again this was a class, not a superhero franchise. Some were brilliant, some were average, some were deeply overconfident and died immediately. History remembers the first group. The ground remembers the rest. Stereotype 4. Everyone was calm, stoic, and emotionless. Feudal Japan is often portrayed as a land of serene faces and internalized suffering. No one raises their voice. No one cries. Everyone accepts tragedy with a single, meaningful nod. This is wildly inaccurate. People in feudal Japan were expressive. They wrote emotional poetry. They wept publicly. They screamed in rage. They threw tantrums. They gossiped constantly. Samurai in particular were known for being dramatic. They wrote death poems. They obsessed over slights. They dueled over perceived disrespect. The Stoic image largely comes from later philosophical interpretations and modern media adaptations that equate emotional restraint with depth. Real humans are rarely that tidy, and historical humans, especially those under constant stress, were often messier still. Stereotype 5. Seppuku happened all the time. Ritual suicide or seppuku looms very large in the popular imagination. Every failure, every embarrassment, every awkward dinner conversation straight to seppuku. In reality, seppuku was relatively rare and highly regulated. It was usually reserved for specific circumstances: judicial punishment, extreme disgrace, or political necessity. Most samurai who failed at something simply lived with Italiano, which sounds obvious, but doesn't make for gripping cinema. Seppuku was also not always voluntary. Being allowed to commit seppuku was often a privilege and alternative to execution, a way for authorities to maintain order while preserving appearances. And it was often messy, painful, and deeply unpleasant, which tends to get glossed over in stylized depictions featuring perfect lighting and symbolic blood patterns. Reality, as usual, was less poetic. Stereotype 6. Ninjas were everywhere. Ah yes, the ninja, Ceylon, dressed in black, appearing exclusively at night, never tripping over anything. Historically, ninja or shinobi did exist, but they were not mystical assassins flipping across rooftops. They were spies, scouts, and saboteurs, information gatherers, and they dressed like normal people, because that's how spying works. It was a delicate balance, and one that frequently failed. Stereotype 9. Daimyo were all-wise, powerful lords. The daimyo, regional lords, are often portrayed as brilliant strategists and enlightened rulers. Some were, many were not. Many were petty, paranoid, obsessed with lineage, deeply insecure. They feuded over borders that barely existed. They betrayed allies over trivial slights. They bankrupted their domains trying to look impressive. Power did not guarantee competence, and the higher you climbed in feudal politics, the more time you spent navigating egos instead of governing, which, again, feels timeless. Stereotype 10. Everyone lived in constant war. Feudal Japan certainly had long periods of violence, especially during the Sengoku period, but it also had long stretches of peace, routine, administration, paperwork. Even during wartime, daily life continued. People farmed, married, argued with neighbors, complained about taxes. War was disrupted, but it wasn't a continuous cinematic montage. Most of history is downtime, and downtime is where people actually live. Genter, pause. So as we drift here, somewhere between myth and reality, it's worth remembering that feudal Japan was not a single story. It was centuries of human behavior, ambition, fear, boredom, tradition, change. Not a land of eternal cherry blossoms and sword duels, but a place full of people doing their best or their worst under systems they did not design. Take a slow breath. Let the stereotypes dissolve a little, because next, we'll wander into something even stranger. What happens when the warriors stop fighting, but refuse to stop being warriors? When you're ready, we'll drift onward. And if you're already asleep, honestly, that's ideal. At some point, in feudal Japan. Something deeply inconvenient happened to the warrior class. Peace. Long, sustained, bureaucratically enforced peace. After centuries of near-constant conflict, alliances collapsing on schedule, and everyone sharpening weapons as a personality trait. The Tokugawa shogunate arrived in the early 17th century and said, very calmly, no more. And, astonishingly, it worked. For over 250 years, Japan experienced relative internal peace. No major civil wars, no roaming armies, no constant need for battlefield heroics. Which sounds lovely, unless your entire identity is built around fighting. The samurai identity crisis. Samurai were trained for violence. They were raised on stories of heroic deaths. They inherited swords before they inherited emotional regulation. And now, there was nothing to do. No enemies to defeat. No wars to win, no dramatic last stands. Instead, samurai became bureaucrats, clerks, tax collectors, record keepers, town administrators. They wore swords while filing paperwork, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Many samurai deeply resented this transition. They still believed they were warriors chosen, elite, morally superior. But society increasingly needed them to be organized, intellectual. And punctual. The rise of the sword with no purpose during this long peace. The sword became less a weapon and more a symbol. Samurai were the only class legally allowed to carry two swords. This visual distinction mattered enormously. It said, I am important. I am dangerous. I deserve respect. Even if the last time you used that sword was to cut paper seals off a document. The irony was not lost on anyone, especially the merchants, who were technically lower in status, but increasingly wealthier. Nothing unsettles a proud warrior like being financially dependent on a rice broker who can legally carry a blade. Naturally, this caused resentment. Quiet resentment, polite resentment, but resentment all the same. Idle hands, very sharp blades, an armed class with nothing to fight is a delicate situation. Some samurai coped by becoming scholars. They studied Confucian philosophy, calligraphy, poetry. Others took up martial arts as personal refinement rather than battlefield training. And some simply became insufferable. There were samurai who wandered towns looking for excuses to assert their status. Insults were taken seriously. Eye contact was dangerous. Accidental bumps could turn lethal. This behavior had a name: sugijiri. Testing a sword on a random passer. It was illegal, heavily punished, and relatively rare. But the fact that it existed at all says something about the psychological strain of enforced peace on people trained for violence. Honor. Now, with rules and footnotes during this period, ideas about honor became increasingly formalized. Because when you don't have wars to demonstrate your values, you write about them instead. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was refined, recorded, and philosophized. Loyalty, self-control, duty, frugality. Conveniently, all qualities that make someone easier to govern. These writings often idealized a past that was far more chaotic than remembered. The real Sengoku period was messy, brutal, filled with betrayal and opportunism. But nostalgia has a way of sanding down sharp edges, especially when your present involves auditing grain stores. The merchant problem. One of the great quiet humiliations of the Edo period was the rise of merchants. According to the official social hierarchy, merchants were at the bottom. They produced nothing. They merely moved goods around, which was considered morally suspicious. Unfortunately for the samurai, merchants were also becoming rich. Very rich. They funded cities. They lent money. They sponsored art and theater. Samurai, meanwhile, were often paid fixed stipends that did not adjust for inflation. So over time, many warriors became poor, proud, armed, and financially stressed. This led to the deeply uncomfortable situation where samurai borrowed money from people they were socially supposed to despise. And nothing erodes dignity faster than owing rent to someone you're not allowed to respect. The slow decay of status as generations passed. Many samurai families found themselves increasingly disconnected from actual combat skills. They inherited rank, not experience. Some trained diligently, others didn't. By the late Edo period, there were samurai who had never drawn a sword in anger, or fear, or necessity. Their identity became ceremonial. Clothing, language, manners, a performance of warriorhood. And like all performances, it required an audience that was slowly losing interest. A society holding its breath, this long peace created stability, but Also tension, rules multiplied. Etiquette became rigid, deviation was discouraged. Everyone knew where they stood, and where they were not allowed to go. For samurai, this meant honor without outlets, status without power, weapons without war. The system worked, until I didn't. And when it finally cracked, it did so very suddenly. But we're not there yet. For now, let's linger in this strange calm. This suspended moment where history's quietly reorganizing itself. Take another slow breath, because next, we'll drift into the deeply personal side of feudal Japan. Not the battles, not the politics, but the homes, the marriages, the expectations, and the emotional claustrophobia of living your entire life according to rules written by people long dead. When you're ready, we'll continue. When we talk about feudal Japan, we usually imagine public life, battles, castles, ceremonies performed very slowly for very serious reasons. But tonight, we're slipping indoors, past the paper screens, into the quiet rooms where people actually lived and slept and argued and married people they had never met. Marriage, a political chore. For the elite samurai families, daimyo households, court nobu's marriage was not about affection. It was about survival. Who you married determined alliances. Loyalty, security, love was optional and rarely consulted. Marriages were arranged early, sometimes when both parties were still children, sometimes when one party was very much a child and the other was not. This was not considered strange. It was considered efficient. A daughter was married off to strengthen a political bond, a son married to secure heirs and stability. Compatibility was not the goal. Compliance was the role of the wife. Elite women were expected to be quiet, composed, and endlessly resilient. They managed households, supervised servants, raised children. They were responsible for maintaining family honor, often with fewer rights than the people judging them. A wife's behavior reflected directly on her husband's reputation, which is a lot of pressure for someone who had no say in where she lived or whom she married. Divorce was possible, but usually initiated by men. A husband could end a marriage with a letter, sometimes literally a letter, which made long-term emotional investment risky. Concubines and complications for wealthy men. Concubines were common. This was not considered scandalous. It was practical. If a wife failed to produce an heir, a concubine might. If a wife did, another woman was already available. This arrangement, unsurprisingly, created tension. Children born to concubines could inherit, which meant rivalry, quiet resentment, and lifelong insecurity for everyone involved. Family life was rarely simple. It was layered, hierarchical, and emotionally exhausting. Childhood, brief and serious. Children in feudal Japan were not treated as fragile innocent. They were future adults in training. Samurai boys began learning disciplined, early etiquette, martial skills, obedience. Mistakes were corrected firmly, sometimes harshly. Samurai girls were trained in household management, propriety, and endurance. Emotional expression was discouraged. Self-control was praised. Childhood was short. Expectation arrived early. Parental distance. Many elite children were raised by servants or wet nurses. Parents, especially fathers, were distant figures. Respected, feared, observed, affection was subtle. Rarely, verbal. This distance reinforced hierarchy within the family. It also meant that many children grew up craving approval they would never quite receive, which, historically speaking, is a very efficient way to create anxious adults who obey authority. Education and pressure literacy was valued among the samurai class. Children studied reading, writing, and moral philosophy. Confucian ideals emphasized loyalty, duty, and knowing one's place. Failure was not just personal, it was familial. To embarrass your family was a serious offense, sometimes worse than physical punishment. So children learned to perform, to suppress, to endure. And many carried that weight quietly for life. Homes that were not safe havens. The home was not a refuge from social rules. It was an extension of them. Hierarchy was enforced at every level. Who sat where? Who spoke first? Who remained silent? Privacy was limited. Walls were thin. Servants were everywhere. Even grief had expectations. There were proper ways to mourn. Proper durations, proper expressions. Too much emotion was unseemly. Too little was suspicious. You were always being watched. Loneliness, very polite and well. With arranged marriages, distant parents, and rigid roles, many people lived deeply lonely lives. They fulfilled their duties. They followed the rules. They aged. Personal happiness was not a priority. Endurance was. Which is not to say people never found joy. They did. In poetry, in quiet friendships, in small, fleeting moments. But joy was private. Duty was public. A gentle stillness. So here we are. Inside the lives, behind the armor. People constrained by expectations. Roles inherited, not chosen. Emotions carefully folded away, like ceremonial clothing. Feudal Japan was not only shaped by battles and politics, it was shaped by quiet rooms, by marriages that felt like contracts, by children who learned early not to ask for too much. Take a slow breath. In the next part, we'll drift even further into the shadows, into the rulers themselves. The lords, the shoguns, the elite figures who held power were often quietly undone by it. Petty, paranoid, and deeply, profoundly human. But for now, rest here a moment. History isn't going anywhere. Power, in feudal Japan, was rarely relaxing. It looked impressive from the outside castles on hills, banners snapping in the wind, attendants kneeling at just the right angle. But inside those castles lived people who slept lightly, trusted no one, and spent an astonishing amount of time worrying about betrayal, which, to be fair, was often justified. The daimyo lords of everything and masters of anxiety, the regional lords, the daimyo controlled land, armies, and thousands of lives. They also lived under constant scrutiny, by rivals, by retainers, by the shogunate. One wrong move could mean confiscation of lands, house arrest, or a very polite invitation to disappear. So daimyo became cautious, and then paranoid, and then deeply exhausting to be around. They monitored their vassals obsessively. They read hidden meanings into minor mistakes. They punished imagined disloyalty before it had a chance to become real, which created a culture where everyone was nervous and no one was honest. Hostages. But make it formal, one of the more unsettling features of Tokugawa rule was the system of alternate attendance. Daimyo were required to spend every other year in Edo, the shogun's capital. Their families stayed there permanently. This ensured loyalty, because nothing discourages rebellion quite like knowing your wife and children are technically hostile. It was called policy. It was described as stability, and it worked. But it also meant that elite families lived split lives. Constant travel, permanent separation, Kiat resentment. The road to Edo was busy and emotionally draining. Castles, beautiful, cold, and full of rules. Japanese castles were not cozy medieval fortresses. They were administrative centers, symbols of authority, and deeply uncomfortable homes. Winters were cold. Heating was minimal. Privacy was non-existent. Rooms were divided by screens that did very little to stop sound or secrets. Every movement was observed, every gesture noted. You were never off duty. Even your sleep belonged to the state, the shogun. The man who wasn't the emperor at the top of it all sat the shogun. Technically not the emperor, practically everything else. The emperor existed, sacred, symbolic, politely irrelevant. The shogun ruled, which meant managing daimyo egos, enforcing peace, and maintaining the illusion that everyone was content with this arrangement. It was less about commanding armies and more about managing personalities. A deeply tiring job. Tokugawa Ieyasu Peisen, paranoid, and very effective Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, was not flashy. He did not rush. He did not gamble recklessly. He waited. He survived betrayals. He endured humiliation. He outlived rivals. And then, quietly, he took everything. Ieyasu understood something crucial. Victory does not always go to the bold. Sometimes it goes to the man who lives long enough for everyone else to make mistakes, which is less romantic bet, extremely successful. Later shoguns, inheriting the pressure, Ieyasu's successors inherited a stable system. They also inherited the anxiety that came with maintaining it. Some were competent, some were indifferent, some were deeply unsuited to leadership, but the system required them to appear authoritative at all times. Weakness was dangerous, so mistakes were hidden, failures blamed elsewhere, and problems quietly postponed, which, historically speaking, never ends well. Petty conflicts at the top despite enforced peace. Elite life was full of small conflicts. Disputes over seating arrangements, over ceremonial precedence, over whose gate was larger. These things mattered enormously. Because, in a rigid hierarchy, symbols are everything. To be placed slightly lower was an insult. To be overlooked was a threat. So grown men argued politely over details that seem absurd now. But at the time, these details defined survival. Mental strain and silent suffering. There is quiet evidence that many elites struggled mentally. Depression, anxiety, paranoia. But these were not named. They were endured. To admit weakness was dangerous. So suffering went inward, into sleepless nights, into ritual, into obsessive adherence to rules, and occasionally into sudden, dramatic collapse. A still moment, so here we are, at the top of feudal society, surrounded by power and quietly crushed by it. Lords who ruled thousands but could not relax. Rulers who enforced peace but lived in constant fear. Take a slow breath. In the next part, we'll begin to watch this carefully balanced world start to wobble. New ideas, foreign pressure, change arriving whether it was invited or not. But for now, let the castles fade into the dark. Stone walls, paper screens, a world holding itself very still. Rest, ar, erre. For a long time, feudal Japan lived with the comforting belief that nothing truly new was going to happen. The rules were established. The hierarchy was fixed. The peace was managed. And then, inevitably, the outside world arrived. Uninvited, persistent, and very inconvenient. A brief reminder, Japan was never fully closed. Despite the popular image of total isolation, Japan always had limited contact with the outside world. Dutch traders, Chinese merchants, carefully monitored exchange at specific ports. Foreign knowledge trickled in medicine, astronomy, maps, but it was controlled. Contained, predictable, which is exactly how authorities liked it. Foreign ideas, quietly dangerous. Western science and technology were studied cautiously under Rangaku or Dutch learning. Books were translated, instruments examined, knowledge absorbed, all while officially pretending this wasn't happening too much. Because ideas are difficult to regulate once they exist. And some of these ideas about governance, economics, military they suggested alternatives. And alternatives make rigid systems nervous. The Black Ships arrive in 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with American warships. They were large, they were lewd, they were armed, and they refused to leave. The message was simple. Open your ports, or else Japan, which had carefully avoided this scenario for centuries, now had to respond. Pretending nothing was happening was no longer an option. Panic. Very polite panic. The arrival of the Black Ships caused widespread anxiety. The shogunate debated. Officials argued, no one agreed. Some wanted to resist. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to delay and hope the problem went away. It did not. Treaties were signed. Ports were opened. And suddenly, the shogunate looked weak, which was far more dangerous than foreign ships. Samurai without a role again. Once more, samurai found themselves in an identity crisis. They were supposed to protect the country, and yet they had been unable to stop this intrusion. Some blamed the shogunate, some blamed foreigners, some blamed everyone. Calls for reform grew louder. So did calls to restore power to the emperor, which, until now, had been a mostly symbolic position. Symbols, it turned out, were about to matter a great deal. The emperor returns to relevance. The idea of revering the emperor and expelling foreigners gained popularity. It was emotionally satisfying. It offered clarity, and it gave frustrated samurai something to believe in. Political factions formed. Violence returned small, targeted, and deeply unsettling. The long peace was cracking. A system that could not bend forever. The Tokugawa system had been built for stability, not adaptation. It was excellent at maintaining order, less good at responding to change. Economic pressures mounted. Social tensions grew. Loyalty fractured. The careful balance of fear, ritual, and hierarchy began to fail. And once it failed quickly. A world on the edge. By the 1860s, it was clear that feudal Japan was nearing its end. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet unraveling. Old certainties no longer held. New realities pressed in, and everyone, samurai, peasants, lords felt it. Take a slow breath, because in the next part, we'll let the old world finally slip away. The end of the samurai, the end of feudal hierarchy, and the strange, disorienting beginning of something entirely new. But for now, rest here. The ships have docked. The night is still, and history is about to change. Wir sind Channel 4, full video.